Live from the Jorgensen Center for the Performing Arts at the University of Connecticut. Fox Connecticut, the Hartford Courant, the Connecticut Daily Newspaper Association, and UConn bring you the U.S. Senate debate.
And good evening, I'm Al Terzi from Fox Connecticut, and tonight we are presenting the Connecticut U.S. Senate debate between the Republican candidate, Linda McMahon, and the Democrat, Chris Murphy. Welcome to you both. We look forward to hearing more about your ideas and maybe learning some new things tonight. This debate is going to cover a wide range of topics, from the economy to foreign policy. And joining me this evening are our three panelists. First, Fox Connecticut reporter, my co-host in the Political Power Hour at Fox Connecticut, Lori Perez. Also, we have Hartford Courant Capitol Bureau Chief Chris Keating and UConn Assistant Professor of Political Science, Vincent Moscardelli. Our format for this evening is as follows. There will be no opening statement. That way we can get right to the questions and answers. But there will be a 60-second closing statement from each candidate at the conclusion. When a question is asked, the candidates will each have 60 seconds to answer, and then 30 seconds each for rebuttal. We do have timekeepers from the League of Women Voters. They will signal when the time is up. Now, there was a card draw at midday today to determine which candidate will start the debate. As a result of that card draw, Mr. Murphy will go first in answering the first question, and after that, we'll alternate who goes first. But in accordance with the card draw, Mr. Murphy will go first when we get to the closing statements. And they have not been shared, by the way, these subjects and specific questions which were chosen by Fox Connecticut and the Hartford Courant. They've not been shared with or cleared by either campaign. One more note, the audience here in the Jorgensen Center has promised to remain quiet and attentive with no cheering or jeering and no applause or outbursts of any kind during this debate, because that takes up more time and time away from learning something about these candidates. So with that, let's begin. Our first topic is top of mind for many, if not most voters, and that is the nation's economy. And Fox Connecticut's Lori Perez will be asking the first question of Mr. Murphy. Lori?
Thanks, Al. Mr. Murphy, you have talked a lot about protecting American manufacturing jobs, but your opponent has criticized you for not having a comprehensive jobs plan. Do you? Tell us about it.
Well, thank you, Lori, for the question, and thank you to all of our sponsors for being here and having us here. Thank you especially to UConn. This is special for my wife and Kathy and I, because we met each other at UConn Law School, and this, unfortunately, being at a debate is about as romantic as it gets these days for Kathy and I. But let's talk about this, because protecting manufacturing is just absolutely critical to protecting this state moving forward. I do have a jobs plan. Linda McMahon should stop saying that I don't, and manufacturing is at the heart of it. I've founded a group in Washington called the Buy America Caucus. And the Buy America Caucus stands for a simple premise, that when we send our taxpayer dollars to Washington, they should be used to fund work and jobs here in America instead of sending work overseas. We think we could create 600,000 new manufacturing jobs if we just close the loopholes in the Buy America law. It's an essential part of my jobs plan. And here in Connecticut, a state which relies more heavily on manufacturing than the average in other states, it will make a big difference.
Your time is up. Thank you.
Mrs. McMahon, you have talked quite a bit about your track record of creating jobs as a business owner, of course, but as a U.S. Senator, how would you create jobs?
Well, I do have a 6-point plan, and Congressman Murphy doesn't have a plan. Buy America is a slogan. It's not a plan. My plan is 6 points. It cuts taxes for the middle class. It cuts taxes on businesses so we're globally competitive. It rolls back overburdensome regulations. It cuts spending 1%, 1 penny out of every dollar. It empowers our workforce so that we are training our folks for the jobs that we have available. And lastly, it calls for a comprehensive energy policy that will continue to drill for our oil and our natural gas, while at the same time we develop our renewables, our wind, our solar, our geothermal. So I do have a comprehensive 6-point plan, and Congressman Murphy says that his is a work in progress. We've asked him to show us his plan. He hasn't, and so we don't have any opportunity to comment on it.
Thank you, Mrs. McMahon. Mr. Murphy, you have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Well, listen, it's just a fiction. I mean, it's made up. We have a jobs plan, but I have a jobs record, and that's what matters. And this idea to try to trivialize Buy American, talk to the workers at Ansonia Copper and Brass in Waterbury or Colonial Bronze in Torrington who are going to be put out of work because our government is shipping jobs overseas. It's not a slogan to them. It's their livelihood. And we should take seriously the premise that when we send our taxpayer dollars to Washington, they should be used to create jobs here. That's real life for people that need to have a job.
Mrs. McMahon, 30 seconds.
Ironically, though, Congressman Murphy, both chances that you had to vote for your Buy America Act, you voted against it. So I'm not quite sure how that's an integral part of your jobs plan. And if you had a jobs plan, you know, you've said rely on your record. Well, let's look back at your failed policies. Debt's almost doubled. Our deficit has increased. Unemployment's on the rise. These are not things that are part of an active jobs plan that are going to put our people back to work.
Thank you, Mrs. McMahon. Our next topic deals with something we all worry about, and that is taxes. And Chris Keating will ask that question first to Mrs. McMahon.
Mrs. McMahon, there's broad consensus that extending the Bush tax cuts for the middle class is a good idea. But there's sharp disagreement about whether the wealthy should benefit as well. How will you keeping taxes lower on the wealthiest Americans benefit the economy as a whole?
Well, in my jobs plan, I do call for a tax cut for the middle class. I would keep all of the other tax brackets in place, which means there would be no gain or loss for others. You know, even President Obama in 2010 said that we should not increase taxes when we're in a recession. Well, we're barely out of a recession. Our GDP growth was only 1.3%. I don't think that now is the time to raise taxes, but my plan does call for a tax cut for the middle class, and I'm the only one on the stage who has called for a tax cut for middle class. We need to make sure, though, that if our economy starts to turn around, and we are improving, I would recommend that we pay more taxes. I'd be willing to pay more taxes as long as those taxes were used to pay down the debt and the deficit and not to continue with the runaway spending that we have in Washington.
Mr. Murphy, could raising taxes on the wealthy prove to be a disincentive for investment and growth?
Well, the centerpiece of Linda McMahon's economic plan is an extension of the Bush tax cuts on the wealthy. We know that tax cuts for the rich don't work because we tried it during the Bush administration. If tax cuts for the rich worked, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in today. And the question is just this. If we have $7 million to allocate somehow in our economy, does it make sense to give it to Linda McMahon in a new tax cut above and beyond current law? That's the truth. Or put it in the hands of middle-class families? Does it make sense to give Linda McMahon another $7 million tax cut or lower class sizes in Willimantic? Does it make sense to give Linda McMahon another $7 million tax cut or try to put construction workers back on the job? There is a difference between us on this issue. I think we've got to get serious about deficit reduction. That's why I don't think we should reauthorize the Bush tax cuts for the very wealthy. Linda McMahon's plan is a recipe to absolutely explode the deficit, doing great harm to our economy.
Mrs. McMahon, you have 30 seconds.
Well, studies have shown that if your proposal of allowing all of the Bush tax cuts to go forward, except those in the upper income, we would lose 700,000 jobs. I don't think that's a plan to create jobs. My plan, which you've not characterized correctly, calls for keeping all of the tax levels the same, except cutting taxes for the middle class. I get no tax cut. What you're talking about is increase of taxes across the board. You've voted to increase taxes on the middle class twice already. I would not do that.
Mr. Murphy, 30 seconds.
Well, here's what an economics professor here at UConn says about Linda McMahon's plan. He says that it would balloon the deficit at a phenomenal rate. Here's the numbers, and at some point arithmetic has to matter in this debate. Linda McMahon calls for $4.1 trillion in tax cuts, and her spending cuts are $360 billion. That's 12 times as many tax cuts as spending cuts. That's why we're in the mess we're in today, because we're not serious about deficit reduction. And if we don't, then this country is going to slip right back into a recession.
Well, thank you. That's a nice segue into our next topic, which deals with cutting the national deficit. And UConn Assistant Professor of Political Science, Vincent Moscardelli, is going to pose that question first to Mr. Murphy.
Mr. Murphy, many believe that the only way to reduce our massive deficits is to cut back on government spending. So please name 3 specific programs you could see eliminating. But before you answer, John Dearborn, a senior political science major here at UConn, wants to know how, at the same time, you can also protect Connecticut defense businesses like Pratt, Sikorsky, and Electric Boat.
Absolutely. I've been proud to have stood up for spending cuts and be specific about it. I don't think that we need $6 billion in agricultural subsidies to Midwestern farmers. I didn't think that we needed a $3 billion duplicative engine program for the new Joint Strike Fighter. I believe that we have to have an across-the-board 1% spending cut in our discretionary budget. And I've been clear over and over that in our Medicare budget, we need to gain efficiencies by stop overpaying insurance companies and drug companies. But our approach to deficit reduction has to be balanced. There's just no way to do this without spending cuts and some additional revenue. And Linda McMahon signed this pledge to Grover Norquist in Washington, D.C., a lobbyist there, saying that she would never, ever vote for any revenue increases into the federal government. We don't need to send somebody to Washington who's going to continue to be part of the obstruction there. We need to send somebody there who's going to bring people together and recognize that ultimately you have to be serious about spending cuts, but the approach has to be balanced.
Your time is up, Mr. Murphy. Thank you. Mrs. McMahon?
Well, we cannot close the debt, obviously, by not reducing spending. But what Congressman Murphy describes is the very dimmest view of the American economy. My plan will cut taxes for the middle class. We'll put middle class back to work. They'll have more money in their pocket. They'll pay more taxes. It is growth in the economy that we're looking for. My plan is a pro-growth plan. We make our businesses competitive on a global basis. We allow our job creators to continue to create jobs. Our economy will grow. We have deficit reduction. We reduce our spending. We put people back to work. When people have money in their pocket, when our middle class has money in their pocket, they buy more goods and services. And when they buy more goods and services, people make more goods and services. And that's the way our economy grows. We need to grow our economy by reducing taxes and reducing our spending.
All right, Mr. Murphy, your rebuttal?
Well, listen, this is just a tried and true Republican talking point that if you cut taxes for the wealthy, ultimately that money is going to trickle down to everybody else so that the economy grows. You know what? We have data on this. We know what happened when we passed massive unfinanced tax cuts for the wealthy in the Bush administration. The economy nearly collapsed. And at some point, we have to study history so that we're not doomed to repeat it. And these talking points, which Linda McMahon gives us today, are the exact same Bush administration talking points that led us to the collapse that we're living in today.
Mrs. McMahon, your thoughts?
Well, if we want to look at history, let's talk about the failed policy since Congressman Murphy has been in Congress. Our debt has almost doubled. Our deficit has increased. We have a 9% unemployment here in our state, and 170,000 people woke up in Connecticut without a job today. I don't think that his policies have worked. They're failed. And we can't keep sending the same people back to Washington who created this mess and expect them now to fix it.
Thank you. Well, you both have been talking quite extensively about this next topic in the last week or so, especially. Lori Perez is going to ask that question first to Mrs. McMahon.
Mrs. McMahon, there has been a lot of debate around the question of how to protect Social Security while at the same time keeping the program's costs in check. What is your solution?
Well, we absolutely are going to have to reform Social Security and Medicare, but there's only one person on this stage that's already voted to take $716 billion out of Medicare. We know that, and I would never support a budget that's going to reduce benefits either through Social Security or Medicare to our seniors. That's a promise to them. We have to keep that promise. And I will certainly fight tooth and nail and never support a budget that would reduce those benefits. However, we know we have to have reform. It's not sustainable. I believe we have to get in a room and in bipartisan fashion, put the issues on the table and address how we're going to reform both Social Security and Medicare. But I am not going to support any policy that would reduce benefits to our seniors.
Murphy, your solution.
Well, once again, Linda McMahon's not giving you any answers. The question was, what are you going to do? And Linda McMahon wouldn't tell you what she's going to do. She just said she'd get everybody in a room and then they'd talk about it. Well, you got to be honest with people about what your plans are. And when the cameras weren't on, Linda McMahon told a Tea Party group that she supported sunsetting Social Security. That's a polite way of saying ending Social Security if certain changes aren't made. She's been on the record over and over again saying that she would support privatizing Medicare for individuals, which could result in $6,000 or more in costs to them. I think you've got to get serious about saving Social Security and strengthening it. I do that by looking at increasing the cap on income that's taxed to go into that fund. And I've clearly been on record as being willing to support cuts in the rate of growth of Medicare so that we take money out of the hands of insurance companies and drug companies and put them in the hands of beneficiaries. I'm willing to be specific. Linda McMahon, in last campaign and this campaign, won't tell the voters where she stands on these issues.
Mrs. McMahon, any specifics?
Well, first of all, Chris, you know you have to be honest. You're not being honest about this whole thing, about my saying that I would sunset Medicare, Social Security. Even the Hartford Courant this morning said that that was a false ad. I have said all along that I would never cut or support a budget that would cut benefits to our seniors, and I won't. Medicare was passed not in a bipartisan way, and I do think we have to have, I'm not a Medicare, Obamacare. We do have to have bipartisan action on these issues.
Mr. Murphy.
Well, Linda McMahon was given another 30 seconds to give you specifics, and she still didn't give you specifics because she doesn't want you to know what she's going to do. And I'm not making this up. I mean, here's exactly what you said. You said, quote, I believe in sunset provisions when we pass legislation like this so that we can take a look at it 10 or 15 years down the road. I'm not putting words in Mrs. McMahon's mouth. I'm just saying what she told a Tea Party group, really the only time that she's been on record giving any specifics about her plans for Social Security and Medicare.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy and Mrs. McMahon. We're going to take a quick break right now. Then we'll be back with more questions for our U.S. Senate candidates on a variety of other topics. Coming up next, live from the University of Connecticut. And we continue our U.S. Senate debate now with candidates Linda McMahon and Chris Murphy. There is one enormous hot-button issue that's divided lawmakers in Washington and impacts everybody, and that's the issue of universal health care, the Affordable Care Act. Chris Keating is going to ask the next question. He's first going to pose it to Mr. Murphy.
Yes, Mr. Murphy. The U.S. Supreme Court has upheld the key parts of the universal health care plan, including the much-debated individual mandate. Which specific elements of Obamacare should be left alone, and which specific elements should be changed?
Well, I've devoted my life to the issue of making sure that everyone in this state has access to affordable quality health care. And I've done that because of little boys like Kyle, 8-year-old who I met with from Simsbury, Connecticut. Kyle is a hemophiliac, and he takes medication about 3 or 4 times a week. It costs his family $3,000 every time he has to take that medication. His insurance plan has a lifetime limit, and without the health care bill, it would bankrupt his family. They'd lose everything. We should make sure that this bill goes into effect, perfect it if we need to, because there are thousands of families out there who are at risk of losing everything because of the costs of health care. There are individuals who lose their jobs simply because they get sick. And I've been proud to stand up for the concept that in the richest country in the world, health care should be a human right, not something that you get if you're just rich enough to afford it. And I'm proud to have played a role in that legislation.
Mrs. McMahon?
Well, I have said that I would like to repeal and replace the Affordable Health Care Act simply because it is anything but affordable. When it was put into place, it was to bend the cost curve down, and it is not doing that. Insurance premiums are going up. Cost of health care is going up. Now, I think there's some good things. In this economy, especially, that children can stay on their parents' policy until they are 26 years old. And I don't think that you should be penalized for pre-existing conditions. But I do think that we can bring down the cost of health care and have reform by being able to buy insurance across state lines and by having tort reform so that we limit the liability that physicians have and bring down the cost of insurance that way. I think that our health care ought to be affordable, it ought to be accessible, and it ought to be portable. And those are the things I think that we've not closed the loop on. And in this new health care bill, there are 21 new tax increases. I don't think we should be increasing taxes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Murphy, rebuttal?
Well, listen, talk to students here at UConn who will be able to stay on their parents' health care plan when they graduate. See if that's helped them. Talk to seniors who go into the drugstore now and pay half as much as they used to for drugs. See if it's helped them. And this mythology that you can just repeal and replace it is just that. The Republicans in Congress that Linda McMahon is seeking to empower have voted to repeal the bill 30-some-odd times and have never voted to replace it. Linda McMahon's going to be a vote to repeal the bill. Period. Stop. Not replace it with anything else.
Mr. McMahon.
Chris, be honest. You're the only one who's voted to take $716 billion out of Medicare. And you've said that that won't impact our seniors. It clearly will, because that money will go for hospitals and doctors. And if doctors and hospitals aren't reimbursed, you know, about 15% of them is estimated will go out of business, and our seniors won't have access to that health care. That is not how we should be treating our seniors, and that's why we need to reform this health care policy.
Thank you. Women's issues certainly played a key role in the recent ad campaigns from both of you. Professor Moscardelli is going to ask the next question first to Mrs. McMahon.
You've both portrayed yourselves in this campaign as advocates of women's rights. How would you balance the desires of institutions that are philosophically opposed to birth control with the government's requirement under the new law that they provide contraception coverage? Mrs. McMahon.
Well, I am a pro-choice candidate, and I certainly believe that women should have access to contraception, and I am all about women's health issues. I'm in favor of women's health issues. Clearly, I'm a woman. I would not be opposed to them. But I think the greatest thing that has happened relative to women are because of the failed policies of Congressman Murphy. More women are out of work. More women are in poverty. And women have the same issues today that everyone has. They're afraid for their jobs. They're worried about making their house payments. They're hoping that their kids that are graduating from college are going to be able to get a job. These are the issues that are really facing our women today. And while health issues are clearly important to them, when I'm traveling around the state, they're not really talking to me about contraception. They're talking to me about how they're going to have a job and how they're going to make ends meet.
Mr. Murphy.
Well, listen, healthcare may not be an economic issue to Linda McMahon, but it is to millions of women in this state. When they don't have access to basic preventative health care, when their employer denies them access to birth control and contraception, that's an economic issue to women in this state who aren't making as much as Linda McMahon does on an annual basis. Linda McMahon supports something called the Blunt Amendment. The Blunt Amendment would allow any employer, religious or non-religious, across this country to deny their female employees access to birth control and contraception. The reason why the head of NARAL Pro-Choice America was here today campaigning for me, spending 2 days trying to make sure that Linda McMahon didn't get elected to the United States Senate, is because pro-choice advocates across this country know that Linda McMahon would empower a radical right in the United States Senate who would deny a woman's right to choose and would vote to end contraception coverage for millions of women across this country.
All right, thank you. Mrs. McMahon.
No, that's just not true. I'm a pro-choice candidate. I've always been a pro-choice candidate. The Blunt Amendment was about separation of church and state and overreach of government. I am for women's access to contraception. I'm for women's health issues. And I'm a pro-choice candidate. Always have been and have not changed that.
Thank you very much. Our next topic. Oh, Mr. Murphy, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. 30 seconds.
I mean, listen, I don't know whether Linda McMahon just didn't read the Blunt Amendment, but it's not about religious employers. The Blunt Amendment would allow any employer, religious or non-religious, to end contraception coverage for their female employees. One Republican senator that came to campaign for Linda McMahon, Lisa Murkowski, said she regretted that vote because she realized it was a grave mistake. At that same press conference, Linda McMahon reiterated her support for that piece of legislation. I mean, Linda, you can't continue to run away from the things that you've said you'd support. The Blunt Amendment would deny women access to contraception.
Well, thank you very much. Our next topic is about the conduct of this campaign. And Lori Perez has a question first for Mr. Murphy.
Mr. Murphy, several of our readers and viewers, including Sheila O'Connor of Windsor Locks, say the campaign has been big on negative attacks and short on the issues. Do you have any plans going forward to change the approach?
Well, listen, I think this campaign has to be about the issues because there are big differences between Linda McMahon and I when it comes to the issues. One reporter asked Mrs. McMahon's campaign why she wasn't talking more about the issues in her ads, why she was engaging in these character assaults against me and my family. And her campaign manager said, well, talking about the issues would be a senseless exercise. Well, it would be for Linda McMahon because on the issues, she's wrong. She's not where this state is when it comes to passing another tax cut for the rich. She's not where this state is when it comes to protecting women's health care. She's not where this state is when it comes to standing up to outsourcing. I do think this campaign should be about the issues, not about personal character assassination. And frankly, I hope that the next 3 weeks of this campaign are spent talking about the real issue differences between Linda McMahon and I, the difference in our professional backgrounds, which I think is fair game, and not the kind of personal attacks that we've seen in Linda McMahon's ads.
Mrs. McMahon, do you have any plans to change your approach?
I have been talking since my campaign began about my jobs plan. As I have gone all around our state, the primary issue are jobs and the economy. Congressman Murphy talks about everything but jobs and the economy because he has no plan. Now, he can talk about a plan being based on his past record, but his past record of failed policies. As I said, almost doubling our debt, our deficit increasing, 23 million people in our country either out of work or looking for work. These are the kind of statistics that aren't part of a plan of success of having economic growth. I have a 6-point plan. You can look at it on my website. We have used some outside experts, which have been fully cited in the plan, but Congressman Murphy has no plan. So he talks about everything but. And I think if he wants to really focus on the issues, we can look at the issues also of whether or not he's going to speak about his attendance record, his special loan agreement. He needs to be honest with the people of Connecticut about these issues.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy, rebuttal?
I think you asked Linda McMahon if she was going to stop the character assaults. And she just listed a bunch more of them. I mean, come on. Let's talk about what people out there really want us to talk about. And that is these differences on the issues. I did read Linda McMahon's jobs plan. I read it twice. I read it once when it was on her website, and then I read it again when it was on Republican websites in Washington. She lifted almost fully paragraphs and sentences from websites in Washington written by people that don't have Connecticut's interests at heart. We should be talking about the issues.
Thank you. And once again to the audience, we remind you about your pledge not to cheer or jeer or applaud so we can have more time for the questions and answers. Thank you very much. All right, Mrs. McMahon, your rebuttal.
Well, I certainly think that there have been plenty of negative ads coming from Congressman Murphy as well. He has not talked about the issues. In fact, this very morning, the Hartford Courant, one of our hosts tonight, said that his ads accusing me of information relative to Social Security and Medicare was false. And so let's make sure that we have the facts straight and we're telling the truth. And Congressman Murphy, you need to be honest with the people of Connecticut. Come clean with them about your loan. Come clean with them about your attendance record.
Thank you, Mrs. McMahon. Chris Keating is going to ask the next question, and he will have Mrs. McMahon respond first.
Speaking of the loan, Mrs. McMahon, you have run ads saying that in 2008 that Webster Bank had given your opponent a special below-market loan that ordinary people couldn't get, and suggesting that that deal was linked to Mr. Murphy's vote on the bailout bill. But your campaign has also said that only Mr. Murphy knows the details of the loan. So if you don't know those details, why are you saying that he got a special loan?
Well, I've just looked at all of the facts as we know them. That he represented the bank, that he had foreclosure issues. The bank bailed him out of the foreclosure issues. He sat on the finance committee, the Powerful Finance Committee. And then that bank received $400 million of TARP, special bailout money. So it's very easy for Congressman Murphy. Congressman Murphy, why don't you just release the records and show, and it's very easy to exonerate yourself or prove what the real facts are, but neither you nor the bank has been willing to release those documents. So I would just say, please release the documents.
Thank you, Mr. McMahon. Chris?
Mr. Murphy, when your opponent ran ads criticizing you for missing nearly 80% of the committee hearings during your first term, you responded with a campaign describing her ads as false. You then cited a different statistic touting your voting record but not disputing your attendance record at the hearings. So why did you describe Mrs. McMahon's ads as false?
Well, they are false. What she's trying to say, essentially, is an attack on my work ethic. And the people of the 5th District know that I've worked my tail off for them, that I've played well above my weight in winning projects and fighting and winning fights for them. But this attack that Linda McMahon has waged on my financial history is ludicrous. And everybody who's looked at this, from the Hartford Courant to the Connecticut Post to independent financial experts, have all said that it's absolutely untrue. And the hypocrisy from Linda McMahon in attacking me on this issue, when she took 36 years to pay back her creditors in a $1 million bankruptcy, when during the exact time that she was running this ad, she was $26,000 overdue on the taxes on her penthouse in Stamford, is just mind-blowing. I mean, Linda McMahon is addicted to personal attacks. It's what she tried to do to Dick Blumenthal 2 years ago, and now she's trying it again this year. It didn't work in 2010, and it's not going to work in 2012.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mrs. McMahon?
I've challenged Congressman Murphy just to release his records. He says everybody that's looked at it has said it's false. Nobody's seen the records. Just show your documents. Won't you do that? You can show them, and then you would lay all this to rest. I just think that personal integrity is an issue. And only in Washington could you miss 75% of your job, get paid $170,000 a year, and then want to get a promotion. That just simply wouldn't happen in the private sector. You're expected to show up for work every single day.
Mr. Murphy, your response.
Linda McMahon cannot talk about the issues in this campaign. I mean, over and over again, she reverts to these character assassinations because she doesn't want to tell people what she really stands for. And again, on this voting issue, I mean, the hypocrisy is just absolutely stunning. Linda McMahon admits that before she was running for the Senate, she, quote, hardly ever voted. She had to show up just once a year to vote, and she herself admits that she barely ever did it. And so spare me the indignation on this issue when Linda McMahon hasn't done her basic civic duty.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I don't need to respond to that. That is just absolutely categorically false, and you know
I'm sorry, Mrs. McMahon. You can use that time to bring that up in the rebuttal to the next question if you like. All right, Professor Moscadelli, he's going to ask the next question, and he'll ask Mr. Murphy to respond first.
I'd like to continue this line of questioning, actually, because as everyone knows, both of you at different points in your lives have had challenges when it comes to paying your debts. Mr. Murphy, Joseph Capicella of Vernon would like to know exactly what voters should make of these lapses on your part and on the part of your opponent.
Well, listen, we've both had financial issues in our life, and the difference is that when I made mistakes, I corrected them. When Linda McMahon made mistakes, she waited to correct them until she was 2 months away from an election. She had a $1 million bankruptcy, and she didn't pay back those creditors until she was asking for people's vote. I don't think it's credible that she didn't know who she owed money to or how much she owed during that period of time. But this campaign ultimately has to be about the people of this state and about what our respective plans for this budget mean for the people of this state. You want to talk about fiscal responsibility, then let's talk about Linda McMahon's economic plan that would cut taxes by 12 times as much as it would cut spending. That's a recipe for fiscal irresponsibility. And frankly, with all due respect, I think that the people of the state want us to be talking about that.
Mrs. McMahon, what should voters make of these lapses on your part and on the part of your opponent?
Well, here's the thing. Everybody can have financial difficulties. If we were talking about a couple of missed credit card payments, a missed mortgage payment, that'd be different. What I'm talking about, what I'm asking Congressman Murphy to come clean about, is a special interest loan. He obtained a special interest loan that middle-class, regular middle-class folks in Connecticut could not get, and he won't come clean about it. He says he voted 97% of the time, and he did, but he didn't show up for 75% of all of his committee hearings when he would have learned about the issues on which he was voting. I won't vote just down party lines. I'm an independent thinker, and I'll be different than my party on a lot of votes. But you just show up to vote without getting the information? I don't think that's what the people of Connecticut want to see. So I'm challenging Congressman Murphy to come clean and to show us his records. It's just not about missing some payments. This is about an issue of integrity and ethics.
Thank you, Mrs. McMahon. Mr. Murphy, your rebuttal.
Well, listen, I think this is about character ultimately. When you make mistakes, do you fix them? I did. Linda McMahon didn't. When Linda McMahon owed people money, she ran away from those obligations for 36 years. She's been pulling in salaries of $30 million, $40 million a year, and still couldn't come to pay back the people of Connecticut that she owed. If you do want to talk about this issue, and I think people want to talk about other things, then the way that you handled your problems and the way that I handled mine do speak to differences between us.
Mrs. McMahon?
Well, I did eventually pay
36. Eventually.
I paid them, Congressman Murphy.
36 years later.
But I did it with my money. You got a special loan from a bank.
Come on.
You got a special loan.
Audience, please let Mrs. McMahon respond.
And I'm going to spend my money making sure that folks like you don't go back to Washington and spend the money from the people of Connecticut.
Thank you. We're going to pause for a break. I think we need one. And then we'll be back with more questions for Connecticut's U.S. Senate candidates next, live from the University of Connecticut. And we're continuing now with the U.S. Senate debate between Linda McMahon and Chris Murphy. Lori Perez is going to ask the next question. Mrs. McMahon will answer first.
Mrs. McMahon, this race is important for Connecticut, but of course it's also important for the nation because the outcome here could go a long way toward deciding which party controls the Senate. Why is it important that your party control the Senate in 2013?
Well, I think what we have seen over the past 4 years are failed policies of an administration where our debt has doubled, our deficit has increased, our respect around the world has declined. And I believe that we need to have senators in Washington who are going to make sure that those qualities are restored to America. You know, the biggest issues that we face today are jobs and the economy. And we can't have a strong foreign policy if we don't have a strong economy. We can't have strong defense if we don't have a strong economy. I mean, Admiral Mullen said that the greatest threat to our security is debt. We have to make sure that we are putting policies in place to get our people back to work. This administration, while Congressman Murphy has been in Washington, has failed policies. That's doubled our debt, increased our employment. 170,000 people woke up in Connecticut without a job. We need to change that.
Mr. Murphy?
Well, that wasn't the answer to the question. The answer to the question was, why should the Republicans be in charge of the United States Senate? And let's be honest, what's happened to the Republican Party in this country? It's not the Republican Party of our parents or our grandparents. It's become a radical party. And Linda McMahon would empower a Republican majority in the Senate who would stop at nothing to end a woman's right to choose. It would stop at nothing to destroy environmental protection, a party now that denies global warming even exists. A party that would seek to perpetuate another round of massive tax cuts for the wealthy at the expense of the middle class. Voters are deciding between Linda McMahon and myself, but they are also deciding whether the Tea Party should be in charge of the United States Senate or Democrats should. And I think both are relevant considerations, but there are national implications to this race. And the kind of people that Linda McMahon would empower in the Senate do not have Connecticut's interests at heart.
All right, Mrs. McMahon, your response, your rebuttal?
Congressman Murphy still tries to paint me in a corner, but he knows that that's not my plan. He knows that I'm an independent thinker. He knows that I differ from my party on various issues. And I will be an independent thinker in Washington. I won't vote with my party 98% of the time, as he has done. I won't rubber stamp policies. I'll be an independent thinker in Washington. And I bring to the table experience of job creation, of putting our people back to work, and I have a plan to do that. But he does not.
Mr. Murphy, your rebuttal.
Well, why are all of these Republican senators coming to Connecticut to campaign for Linda McMahon? It's because they know she's going to be a vote for them. And how do they know that? They look at what she stands for. She stands with the national Republicans on the Blunt Amendment. She stands with national Republicans on more tax cuts for the wealthy. She stands with national Republicans when it comes to drilling rather than investment in renewable energy. On issue after issue, she stands with them, which is why they are so wildly enthusiastic about coming to Connecticut to hope that she's the 51st vote for a Tea Party Republican majority in the Senate.
All right. Thank you very much. Our next topic is one that U.S. senators deal with extensively, and that's foreign affairs. Chris Keating has the next question. First to Mr. Murphy.
Mr. Murphy, as we wind down the American presence in Afghanistan and the troops come home, other problems are arising in the Middle East. We all recently saw the images of U.S. embassies under attack in Libya and in Egypt. How aggressive should the United States be when it comes to getting involved in the internal affairs of these and other countries?
Well, I ran for Congress in 2006 as an opponent of the Iraq War. I couldn't just sit back and let my congresswoman at the time continue President Bush's open-ended commitment there. And so I put myself on the line to bring our troops home. And I'm now a believer that it's time to wrap up our commitment in Afghanistan. I don't think it's in our strategic interest to stay there any longer, but more importantly, I don't think we can afford to spend $2 billion a week in Afghanistan. I think we should bring our men and women home. And I've fought hard to use both my voice and my vote to do that. And I think moving forward, we have to be a lot more stingy about how we use American resources abroad and commit ourselves to the notion that if we do engage in foreign intervention, it has to be in a multilateral basis. The biggest mistakes we have made as a nation is when we have gone in alone. And so I've been proud of my commitment to bringing our troops home from Afghanistan, my commitment to a new foreign policy based on, I think, much more stringent intervention, and that'll be the kind of senator I'll be.
Mrs. McMahon, the same question.
I do not think the United States should be involved in war in a different country unless its vital U.S. interest is at stake. And if we go in, we need to go in with a plan of action, complete that plan of action, and come out. I'm also for bringing our troops home from Afghanistan along the timetable that President Obama has established. I don't think I would have gone in and established and said when we were withdrawing, but since he has done that, I want to bring our troops home on that timetable while we protect those who are left behind. We have to have a strong foreign policy, and I believe, as Ronald Reagan said, it's peace through strength. Congressman Murphy has voted twice to defund our jobs at Electric Boat, costing our state jobs potentially as many as 35,000. We need to have a strong defense, and we can't have a strong defense if we defund those budgets, and especially when every other member of the Connecticut delegation voted for it.
Thank you, Mrs. McMahon. Mr. Murphy, your rebuttal.
Well, I'm proud to have been part of a delegation that won a commitment to build 2 submarines at Electric Boat. I'm proud to be part of a delegation that won a single-source contract for the new engine on the Joint Strike Fighter to be built by Pratt & Whitney. But there is a difference between Linda McMahon and I on Afghanistan. Linda McMahon wants to stay there for another 2 years, costing this country $2 billion a week that could be, frankly, used here at home for defense production. I think that that's too expensive a commitment, and I'd rather see those dollars spent on defense production in Connecticut rather than a war overseas.
Thank you, Mrs. McMahon.
Defense production in Connecticut, but Congressman Murphy, you just recently voted twice to make sure that under the defense authorization bill we didn't get the money for those jobs at Electric Boat. Could cost as many as $35,000, and if sequestration continues, and you're prepared to let it continue, we could lose 1 million jobs nationwide and 35,000 jobs at Electric Boat. We have to have a strong defense, but your record recently is not one that shows that you're willing to support those jobs right here in our state, and that's the facts.
All right, thank you very much. For our next question, you will each have 60 seconds to answer, but because of our time constraints, there will be no rebuttals. Professor Mascardelli will pose this question first to Mrs. McMahon.
Mrs. McMahon, you've touted your experience in business as a key asset, but some of your critics say that that doesn't qualify you to handle the business of the United States Senate. Do they have a fair point?
Well, I think that what we need to do is to send someone to Washington who's had experience creating jobs. Look, we need a blend of representation in Washington, and the biggest hole that we have are those from the private sector, from businesses. You know, a CEO has to set a strategic vision of a company, build the teams to execute that vision. He has to manage them, motivate them, and lead them, and I'm good at that, and I have a good track record at that. I think those skills are missing in Washington. We need business leaders who understand that when you negotiate, you come to the table, you debate robustly, but when you walk away, each side has gotten some of what it wanted, but not all of what it wanted. And I think that that's missing in Washington today. Our sides are so divided. Nobody's coming to the middle to negotiate. And I'm not talking about giving up principles. I'm talking about negotiating for the good of our country. You know, the CEO of Starbucks said last July that he hoped when the elections were over in November that neither the Republicans or Democrats would feel they won, but the American public would think they had won.
Mr. Murphy, you've been criticized by some as someone who has little experience other than being in politics. Do those critics have a fair point? Well,
listen, I think that not every CEO is qualified to be a United States Senator. And I think Linda McMahon is an example of the kind of CEO that is not. She denied her wrestlers health care when they badly needed it. She shipped jobs overseas when we needed them here. She took $10 million in tax credits from this state designed to create jobs, and at the same time she laid off 10% of her workforce while making $46 million, refusing to just take a little bit of a pay cut to keep people employed. She's put her record as a CEO front and center in this race. And I think in a lot of times, being a CEO can qualify you for higher office. But Linda McMahon has shown consistently that as a CEO, she put her interests first, over and over and over again, at the expense of this state, our taxpayers, and her employees that relied on her. I don't think that qualifies you to be a U.S. Senator.
All right, now at this point in the program, each candidate will have 1 minute to offer a closing statement. And based on the drawing to determine the speaking order, Mr. Murphy will go first. You have 60 seconds, sir.
Well, again, thank you very much to our sponsors here today. You know, earlier in the debate, Linda McMahon got a question about why couldn't she talk about something other than personal attacks, and she answered it by lodging more personal attacks against me and my family. That's what she's going to try to make the rest of this race about. And as I challenge the people of the state at our debate on Sunday, don't let her do it. Make this race be about you. Ask the question, which one of us is going to stand up for the seniors of this state who can't have their Medicare privatized or their Social Security ended? Who's going to stand up for the factory worker who can't continue to see jobs sent overseas? Who's going to stand up for students here at UConn who need a senator who's going to fight to make college more affordable? If that's the question in this race, there's only one choice. Linda McMahon, over her career, has stood up only for herself, not for us. My entire career has been dedicated to fighting for the people of this state, and I can't wait to continue to do it as a U.S. Senator. Thank you all for being here tonight. Mrs.
McMahon, you have 1 minute, the last word.
I, too, would like to thank our hosts, our panelists, and for those of you who've joined us this evening. Connecticut, it's time. It's time to elect a senator who's a job creator with a real plan to put people back to work, who'll cut taxes for the middle class, who values showing up for work, who can't be bought by special interests. We don't need another senator whose primary aspiration is political career. We need someone who's going to tell us that our kids and our grandkids are going to be better off than we are. We can't afford 6 more years of Congressman Murphy's failed policies, of higher unemployment, of higher costs for gas and groceries, of higher taxes on the middle class, of lower wages, and homes moving into foreclosure. Connecticut, it's time. It's time to elect a senator who will bring knowledge and experience to create jobs and who believes that America's best days are ahead. I'm Linda McMahon, and I'd be honored to have your vote on November 6th.
Thank you very much, Mrs. McMahon and Mr. Murphy. That concludes tonight's debate. We'd like to thank the folks here at the University of Connecticut, as well as Fox Connecticut and the Hartford Courant, and our panelists, Laurie Perez, Chris Keating, and Vincent Moscardelli. And thank you to Gloria Bent and Carol McMillan from the League of Women Voters for serving as our timekeepers this evening. And we leave you tonight with a few words from the CEO, President, and Publisher of the Hartford Courant, Richard Graziano.
Thank you for watching tonight's debate for Connecticut's U.S. Senate seat. And a special thank you to the University of Connecticut and to the League of Women Voters for serving as timekeepers for tonight's debate. Fox Connecticut and the Hartford Courant believe in an open, accessible, and honorable democratic process. We believe in every citizen's right to know, and that a healthy democracy requires an informed and engaged electorate. And lastly, we encourage you to get out and vote on November 6th. From all of us at Fox Connecticut, the Hartford Courant, and UConn, have a great evening.